Most of us like to think of ourselves as open-minded and tolerant. From trying new foods as kids to meeting people from different backgrounds, we're told over and over that tolerance is a virtue. And often, it is tolerance helps us learn, grow, and live peacefully with others. But what if tolerance, taken to its extreme, actually works against itself? The surprising truth is, being too tolerant can lead to intolerance winning. Imagine you're part of a group formed to promote inclusion and fight discrimination. Everyone is welcome, no matter their background or beliefs. But then, a few members join, who openly dislike others in the group. They say hurtful things, make others uncomfortable, and push people out. When you try to remove them, they say, "Aren't you being intolerant of our views? Isn't this a group for tolerance?" And technically, they're not wrong. This is where things get tricky. This scenario illustrates something called the paradox of tolerance, a concept introduced by philosopher Karl Popper in 1945. He argued that if a society is endlessly tolerant, even toward people who are openly intolerant, it will eventually lose its ability to be tolerant at all. In other words, if you let intolerance grow freely, it can take over and destroy the very environment that allowed it in the first place. It's like hosting a dinner party where everyone's welcome, but one guest keeps insulting and threatening the others. If you let that behavior continue in the name of being polite, soon nobody else wants to come. The party stops being inclusive. Not because you weren't nice enough, but because you didn't draw a line. Tolerance has limits, and that's not a failure of tolerance. It's a necessary part of making it work. Being tolerant doesn't mean you have to accept everything. It means protecting the space where respectful coexistence is possible. That sometimes requires saying no to behaviors and attitudes that threaten others' safety or dignity. This isn't just a philosophical thought experiment. In real life, it applies to communities, workplaces, classrooms, and even friend groups. If someone consistently brings harm or hostility, keeping them around in the name of being open-minded can backfire. Being a tolerant person doesn't mean accepting harm. It means knowing when to stand up and say, "This behavior doesn't belong here." That's how we protect the values we care about, by understanding that sometimes the most tolerant thing you can do is to be a little intolerant of intolerance. This thought experiment isn't just a clever philosophical puzzle. It highlights a real problem we all face in everyday life. The tension between being open to others and protecting ourselves or our communities from harm. And while the basic logic of the paradox of tolerance may seem obvious once explained, applying it is anything but simple. One major challenge is defining what counts as harmful. Physical violence is easy to identify, but emotional harm, offensive speech, or cultural insensitivity can be much more subjective. What one person sees as honest disagreement, another may experience as deeply threatening. That's where things start to get messy. Even more complicated is the fact that many intolerant people don't believe they're being intolerant. They may say, "This is just my belief," or "I'm just expressing my opinion." They often don't see themselves as dangerous or aggressive. In fact, they may genuinely feel that they are the ones being silenced or excluded. And sometimes they are, just not for the reasons they think. This creates a difficult balancing act. If we tolerate everything in the name of fairness, we risk enabling the very forces that would dismantle fairness altogether. But if we police speech and beliefs too strictly, we might end up enforcing a narrow, rigid worldview that shuts down legitimate disagreement. One helpful way to think about this is through the idea of boundaries, not blanket rules. Instead of asking, should we tolerate all speech, we can ask, what kinds of behavior undermine trust, safety, or participation in this group? When someone's views directly threaten others' ability to exist safely and equally in a shared space, that's a boundary worth defending. Tolerance isn't just about letting people speak. It's also about who gets heard and included. If intolerant voices dominate the conversation, more thoughtful or vulnerable voices may withdraw entirely. So the presence of all opinions isn't necessarily a sign of true openness. In some cases, silencing a few can allow many others to finally speak. Popper's paradox shows us that values must be defended to survive. It's not enough to say we believe in kindness, fairness, or inclusion. We have to be willing to stand up for those values, even when it feels uncomfortable or inconsistent. Tolerance is not a passive state. It's an ongoing effort to build and maintain a space where people can thrive together. If we want to live in a world that values tolerance, we have to be willing to be intolerant of intolerance. And that starts by being clear about what we stand for, who we want to protect, and what lines we won't allow to be crossed. Even when we accept that intolerance must sometimes be opposed, the next question is, how? How do we respond to harmful ideas or behaviors without becoming rigid, authoritarian, or hypocritical ourselves? This is where proportionality matters. Not all forms of intolerance are equal. There's a difference between someone expressing discomfort with an idea and someone actively trying to silence or harm others. Treating all conflict as equally dangerous can actually undermine efforts to address real threats. So it's important to respond based on the severity and intent of the behavior, not just its presence. Rules without context can backfire. If you create a zero-tolerance policy toward intolerant behavior, but fail to define what that means, people might misuse it to shut down views they personally dislike. This is why having clear, consistent standards and explaining the reasons behind them is critical. Transparency helps others understand that exclusion isn't about personal dislike. It's about protecting the purpose and health of the group. Still, even with clear rules, people will disagree. That's normal. The goal isn't to erase disagreement, but to create conditions where disagreement doesn't lead to harm or exclusion. You can have a group that debates tough issues as long as the disagreement stays respectful and no one is pushed out because of who they are. One often overlooked factor is power dynamics. When deciding what's tolerable, it's essential to consider who has power and who doesn't. A group member from a dominant or majority background may not feel harmed by certain speech or actions, but someone from a marginalized group might. Ignoring that context can allow subtle forms of exclusion to flourish. So fairness doesn't always mean treating everyone exactly the same. It often means being sensitive to how the same behavior can affect people differently. Tolerance is a practice, not a fixed rule. It needs regular reflection, adjustment, and sometimes correction. Being part of a tolerant community doesn't mean you'll always get it right. It means you care enough to course correct when things start to go off track. That includes being willing to admit mistakes and revise your understanding of what harm and fairness really mean. Defending tolerance isn't about drawing perfect lines once and for all. It's about staying committed to fairness and safety, even when things are unclear or uncomfortable. It requires judgment, humility, and sometimes hard decisions. But if we're serious about creating spaces where people can live and thrive together, it's the kind of work we can't avoid. All of this leads to one often overlooked point. Tolerance requires leadership, not just in official roles or titles, but in action. In any group, whether it's a classroom, workplace, online community, or friend circle, someone needs to be willing to set the tone. And that often means being the first to speak up when things start to go off course. Leadership in tolerance doesn't always look like being nice. It can mean stepping into uncomfortable conversations, holding people accountable, and sometimes saying no. It doesn't mean being aggressive, but it does mean being firm. Avoiding conflict for the sake of keeping peace often creates bigger problems later. Also, while it's tempting to try to debate intolerance away, that approach has limits. Popper himself pointed out that rational arguments only work on people who are willing to argue in good faith. When people use discussion as a weapon to provoke, manipulate, or confuse rather than understand, it's okay to disengage. Not every viewpoint deserves equal time or space. Another important idea is the difference between inclusion and neutrality. Inclusion means making sure everyone who is respectful and constructive has a seat at the table. Neutrality means stepping back and pretending not to take sides, even when one side is clearly harmful. Tolerance works best when it's active, not passive. You don't create a better space by refusing to choose. You create it by choosing well. And on a personal level, we all need to think about how we define our own boundaries. Sometimes we let toxic ideas or people stay in our lives out of guilt, politeness, or fear of seeming closed-minded. But real open-mindedness doesn't mean accepting things that drain your energy or violate your values. It means listening long enough to understand, and then deciding what you're willing to live with, and what you're not. The paradox of tolerance isn't just about society. It's about choices we make every day. Who we let into our lives, what we stand up for, what we're willing to walk away from. Because tolerance is valuable, but it only works if we protect the very conditions that make it possible. By now, it's clear that tolerance isn't a simple yes or no trait. It's a balance. And holding that balance takes constant attention. But there's one more layer to this conversation that often goes unspoken. We don't all start from the same place when it comes to tolerance. Our experiences shape our comfort with difference. Someone raised in a diverse environment might find it easy to accept a range of beliefs and lifestyles. Others, who grew up in more insulated or rigid settings, might struggle more. This doesn't make someone bad or good. It just means we all bring different starting points to the table. And that's worth remembering before we rush to label someone as intolerant. That said, understanding someone's background doesn't excuse harmful behavior, but it does help us decide how to engage. Is the person open to learning? Are they operating from ignorance or from malice? Sometimes people say things they've never thought critically about. Other times, they've made up their mind to push others out. How we respond can and should depend on that difference. There's a difference between disagreement and denial. Disagreeing with someone's opinion is part of healthy discussion. Denying someone's basic identity, dignity, or safety is not. For example, two people can disagree about government policy. But if one person denies the other's right to exist safely in a community, that's not a disagreement, that's a threat. And it deserves a very different response. Learning to be intolerant of intolerance doesn't have to mean becoming combative or harsh. It can mean setting boundaries calmly. It can mean choosing not to engage with harmful ideas at all. It can mean speaking up with others, not alone. Tolerance is a collective effort. The more people who stand up for fairness and safety, the easier it becomes for everyone to do so. In practice, that means asking simple but powerful questions. Is this person's behavior creating space or shrinking it? Are they open to hearing others or only to being heard? Are they participating in good faith or trying to dominate the conversation? Answering these questions can help clarify who belongs in the spaces we're building and who doesn't. The goal isn't perfection. No community gets this right all the time. The point is to keep trying, to be clear about what we stand for, and to make space for those willing to build something better together. Tolerance doesn't mean passivity. It means standing for values strong enough to include and firm enough to defend. At the end of the day, the paradox of tolerance teaches us a simple but essential truth. Good values require protection. It's not enough to believe in inclusion, fairness, or respect. These things have to be guarded, maintained, and sometimes enforced. Otherwise, they erode under pressure. Most people don't notice a breakdown in tolerance until it's already happened. By the time a community feels unsafe or a conversation becomes toxic, the damage is already underway. That's why being proactive matters. Setting expectations, addressing problems early, and reinforcing shared values isn't overreacting. It's how healthy environments are built and kept. This is true in every kind of space: families, schools, workplaces, friend groups, online communities. In each, someone has to be willing to say, "That's not okay here." Not to punish, but to protect the people and the purpose of the space. Also, it's important to accept that not everyone will agree with your boundaries, and that's okay. Some will say you're being unfair or overly sensitive. Others might accuse you of being intolerant yourself. But clarity always beats confusion. If you can explain your reasoning, if you're consistent, honest, and willing to listen, you've already done more than most. We don't have to solve this perfectly to make it work. Being tolerant while guarding against intolerance is a complicated task, and mistakes will happen. What matters most is our willingness to reflect, adjust, and try again. The point isn't to be flawless, it's to be responsible. So if you're ever unsure of what to do, come back to the basics. Am I protecting others' ability to live, speak, and contribute safely? Am I allowing harmful ideas to grow because I'm avoiding discomfort? Am I holding myself to the same standards I expect from others? These aren't always easy questions, but asking them keeps us on track. Because the real strength of tolerance isn't how much we're willing to accept, it's how clearly we know what we won't. That's how inclusive spaces survive. That's how communities grow stronger. And that's how tolerance, used wisely, actually works.